on this episode of Rebel Spirit Radio.
That's another aspect of this work. And of course, that is spooky in a way, because then this means it was created not by accidental forces. And this is very important for us today, because the accidental force thing has become so strong in us that we think we're completely arbitrary beings, and it doesn't make any difference what we do.
Right.
Yeah, so in a way, if we change the climate or if we destroy anything, it doesn't really matter. And it doesn't really matter what we do to the moon or anything else, because we have this illusion in ourselves that our life is just our life and it's arbitrary, and we're a little speck inside an enormous universe.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, author Richard Heath joins me to discuss his book, Sacred Geometry in Ancient Goddess Cultures, The Divine Science of the Female Priesthood. Richard discusses the creation of the astronomical worldview, snake priestesses and the mysteries, the horns of Venus, the myth of Indra conquering a dragon, and how mandalas represent the silent teachings of the grand design. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or review podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated.
Richard Heath is a system designer who studies the technical achievements of the ancient world, from those of the megalithic astronomers to sacred building design. He is the author of several books, including Sacred Number and the Origins of Civilization and Sacred Geometry. He joins me today to discuss his latest book, Sacred Geometry in Ancient Goddess Cultures. Richard, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you, Nick.
Well, I'm very happy that you're here with me today.
Thanks.
Yeah. I found your book very intriguing. I am always curious to know a little bit more about sacred geometry, and I'm not a math person at all. Math and geometry kind of go over my head a little bit. But I wanted to see if I have a good grasp on your main argument, your main thesis here. And please correct me if I don't have it right. But what you are essentially presenting, the evidence that you're presenting, is that the megalithic structures that we know, like Stonehenge, and you actually begin with Çatalhöyük in Turkey, what used to be Anatolia, that there's a connection in terms of the construction, in terms of the geometry, the sacred geometry, and that this was all based on the observations of the sky at the northern hemisphere, and that these structures are, in a sense, like three-dimensional representations of that cosmology. I'll stop there. I think that's a lot of it, but the origins go way back before, not with the Neolithic people, but back to the Mesolithic. And I think, I forget the dating of the Mesolithic. I think it's maybe around 15,000 BCE.
Yes, but people lived in that fashion until something else replaced it. And that was after the Ice Age. And we have a very potted version of what happened in the Neolithic. And work on the Göbekli Tepe has shown research going on with that sort of megalithic-looking monument. You see research on seeded seeds, and all the correct fauna and flora were in that area of Turkey just naturally. And they are the ones that were taken up by the Neolithic innovation. But these people appear to also have roots in something that was a megalithic before the megalithic. So I bring this out as a contradiction in the book.
Right.
And try to work with these themes, really, with not very many places, but to bring out what can't have happened, which is that it's a lot of megalithic sites can't be just labeled Neolithic because farmers don't have the time, especially when they're developing land for 1,000 years. They don't have the time, and neither are they organized around women, apparently. Although, there's probably mixtures of organization. But the thing is that when you have a workforce where everyone's a member of the family and, the men tend to do the extensive and the women the intensive, then this doesn't mean that there's a problem with a workload having a hobby of making megaliths. In other words, you've got a workforce to do it. And your food doesn't have to be grown and it isn't automatically seasonal. And so when that realization crept over me, I realized that in Britain, we have particularly been fobbed off with this term Neolithic because it wasn't that easy. It was very full of trees and lots of work would have to be done. So it's far simpler to assume that they were matrilineally organized.
Yeah, what I find really interesting, and this is, I don't want to say a paradox, but what I always learned, and I think this is the common understanding, is that these large stone structures required agriculture, that people had to be settled and they had to be able to support themselves in order to build them. And what you just said, you're like, no, that doesn't make sense at all, that they need the freedom to be able to build these things.
Yes, because it is very tiring to be a farmer.
Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah.
And that hasn't really changed. And so and the other thing is that deep in history, we see a lot of primitive acts of astronomy, bone counting, as with Alexander Marshak did a project for NASA to celebrate the moon. And he found all these stones all over Europe in museums where, a long bone or a plaque, a shoulder bone or something had marks on it. And he interpreted these marks. He took a long time doing it. And he never got proper recognition for the fact that this meant that there was some astronomy that led into the megalithic that already existed in this population of Mesolithic people.
Okay. There's a lot to go into because this also goes into mythology, and I also want to give due time to the goddess cultures themselves. I will tell you that when I first knew about your book and it mentioned the goddess cultures, the first thing that came into my mind, and you actually address this in the book, was this statue, and I think it's a small little statue, and I learned it as a priestess. You refer to it as a goddess. I don't know that we can tell, of the snake goddess or the snake priestess. And that image, she has a apron on with all of these geometric designs on it.
Yeah.
And if I understand correctly, what you do is you look at the whole image itself as having an astronomical meaning to it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
It just seemed right to me that what we tend to do is we put people in boxes, or whoever these people are, and we call them goddesses in mysterious and maybe rather naughty cults or something.
Right.
Whereas what is going on there probably is they're representing their own state of consciousness. And I find it in a few other examples of this because they're much more direct than we are.
Okay. Yeah, I found that really interesting. And maybe I'm jumping up in advance too much. So we'll take a step back here in a moment.
Right.
But one of the things that I found interesting is that it's looking at the sky and looking at and understanding the movement of the planets, and this is all geometrical. And one of the key features, and this is always associated with the goddess, is the planet Venus. And there is this movement where it presents what you refer to as the horns of Venus. And I think that is really important. And one of the first things that came to mind was Isis in Egypt, for example, because she always has this headdress that has almost like horns on it. And I also note that, and you don't really go into this too much, but there is, going back even to the Paleolithic, depictions of a feminine and a bull, bull, bull. And we still have this with the sign of Taurus that's ruled by Venus.
Yeah, you see it these are the famous evening and morning star.
Mm-hmm.
And between those two stars, Venus jumps out of our vision, and sometimes, though, in front of the sun, you can see it. And then so from the evening, it becomes the morning. And this is the manifestation of the young maiden form of the goddess. And so the earth is the earth mother, and then the wizened goddess is the moon. And when you start counting, they have no choice but really to see things happen on the horizon. That's certainly where they start. And so when they see the sun at the maximum to the north or to the south, or they see the moon at the maximum, or they see the sun at equinox, that gives them a calendar of a natural sort to west and to east, pardon me. And the process that you have to go through here is how does the counting work? And the initial counting is to count probably days, because anything can be used as a counter if it divides up the thing that you're counting. So you count in 59 days, there are 2 lunar months, because there's about 29 and a half days. And there's all sorts of other considerations, but the main point is that you've got a 2-month run calendar, and then you know a few things that you didn't know before. If you're a person who's hunting, or and they might have been interested in fertility as well. So, however that goes, you find that then there are other coincidences that start to occur where things repeat quite quickly. So 1.6 years is quite quick, and it's 8/5 of the solar year. And the two bodies, Venus and Earth, are caught in a Fibonacci series where the two orbits cause this phenomenon to happen every 1.6 years. But then when you look at the actual orbit, they didn't look at it probably, but the actual orbit of Venus, which we know now, it's 13. It's 8/13. So 8/13, these are consecutive numbers for the golden mean. And golden mean is naturally associated with life, because fivefoldness tends to come out in living structures, whereas in rocks and things, you tend to get sixfold structures. So there are, in a way, we're saying that the Stone Age people were phenomenologists in the broadest way.
Right.
They saw it and read it for what it was. And so then when you count the moon it fits within the solar year just with 12 whole moons. But over 3 years, there are 37 moons. That's not 36, 37. So it appears like an anniversary. Well, all sorts of things happen if you just happen to be counting days. That if you use an inch to count a day, the old tally sticks were just like on the prison wall. How many days have I been in prison? Right. Whereas the new idea was to put the equal length, so that there'd be an equal distance between the marks. And when you do that, you inadvertently create metrology, which is a dominant force for the making of buildings later on, and also the accuracy of setting up triangles and to meet. So when we go back to 5000 BC, and there's definitely at that time very little evidence of Neolithic in Brittany, but in Karnak, the greatest monuments almost of Europe, you see that all of the monuments make use of the fact that in that particular moment of time, but even today quite accurately, that the sun goes along the 5 side of a 3, 4, 5 triangle. So all you need to do is lay a 3, 4, 5 triangle once you know that, and you can see where the sun will be either side of east to the winter and to the summer. And then they found that the single square, the diagonal of that, which is 45 degrees, is what was, and pretty well is, the maximum moon, which we're having now. So in January, the maximum moon is going to be at its standstill. And then the minimum moon is a double square. And so you see the action of counting and geometry, sometimes for alignments, but sometimes to do calculations. So you don't expect them to be doing calculations, and the archaeologists cannot bear this idea because this is numerology before the ancient Near East. And we are so used to the standard model of history now that everything has to be Neolithic, and that's quite primitive, or it's happening in the ancient Near East and just eventually comes here, or for us it comes here, you know. But you had your own outburst of this kind of building with the Amerindians and the South Americans.
Yeah.
Didn't you?
Yeah. One of the questions that I have, I guess, is, and again, I really am just coming from a place of wanting to understand, but it seems as if part of the argument that you're presenting, and I can't speak to the the American Indians or Mesoamerica or whatnot, but that there was you extend this back to the end of the last ice age with people living in the Arctic. And then, if I understand correctly, that information then filters down throughout, Europe and makes its way. Is that correct? Or is it something that appeared in different cultures at different times, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of really strange things with the Indo-European language.
Right.
First of all, what I discovered from recent research done by science is that the Indo-European language was diffused by the Neolithic package. So as it went through Europe, through the Hungarian plain and so forth, this is why we have all these Indo-European languages, because they're all dialects of an Indo-European language. But the people in Göbekli Tepe appear to have come from the north. And so I combine that with an idea that a gentleman in India, a scholar in India, had worked out that the Vedas described a lot of interesting astronomy, but also that some of this astronomy came from the Arctic, the polar region. And so to understand how polar astronomy works, it's really an amazing thing, because if you're actually standing on the pole, and assuming it was covered in ice at that point, you would see the pole star of that time, which was Vega, and she is called also the descending one. That's the name of it. And so she is like a carrion bird or something like that would come down. So before the maximum of the ice, before the ice age maximum occurred, there'd been a period when there was the Gulf Stream had melted the Arctic Ocean. And this meant it was possible for people to live in the North Pole counterintuitively when there was ice covering the whole of Europe. I mean, it wasn't necessarily warm, but it was possible. And some people say that the Indo-European languages came from the idea of description. It's an extremely descriptive language. And describing the polar astronomy may have been the cause of the Vedas. But there'd be no evidence of it because it was all wiped out by the Ice Age maximum. And these people would have been escaping from that. So if they came down, we don't know whether they were matriarchal or patriarchal or what. They understood a lot of things about the planets because there they had a night lasted at least 4 months or close. So it's a very weird place to live, when you have one day in an entire year.
Right.
So I got into that, but the point about it is that why did the megalithic do astronomy if it had already been done at the North Pole? But what's interesting is as you come to the south, the astronomy changes. And why did they end up in Karnak at a place where all the Pythagorean triangles and things were working for alignments? It was as if it was chosen by them. And so they were playing with the earth, I think, in one sense, that for them, the phenomenological aspect of it all was a place that made a place significant. What made it significant to be there? And so that if we look at the progress of history, the matriarchal was still surviving along the coastal regions where the megalithic was, down in the Mediterranean and in the north, the western coast of Europe. Yeah. So this is the dynamism of the whole idea of the book, is to try to tell a story that doesn't require you to invent a superculture before the Ice Age.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That helps.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because it's always this question of was there a original culture that diffused and whatnot? And often, I know that, especially speaking of the Vedas, they always place the origin of the Vedas in the Russian steppe lands. What
Yes, that's
referred
right.
to as the Aryans, and that it kind of diffuses down. But those Russian steppe lands aren't that far away from the Arctic.
No.
Yeah.
But
and
it's not something that's very easy to do deep research on.
Right.
So what I'm stressing is the evidence that we have from the megalithic and the amazingly important network of numbers that emerges out of the megalithic astronomy, and presumably got that went into the ancient Near East. And all these our religious texts contain special numbers in them, like 720 or 1440, and these numbers, and they all seem to be related to things like the moon or the resonance of the planets with the moon. Because the planets themselves, the outer planets, are all synchronous with ratios like 9/8, which is a whole tone. So like every full note on your piano is like one of those. And then Saturn has the resonance of the semitone. And those two things together really make a lot of music for us. So And it's, there's also ancient tuning theory where they worked with numbers for understanding music as well. So we're talking about an extremely rich core of information that would probably be quite restricted because most people couldn't read or write, and they had a lot of work to do for somebody else.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was actually one of the questions I had when I was reading your book with all the numbers and everything was I thought, how did these people do this without pen and paper?
Right. Well, they probably had excellent memories.
Yeah.
Do you remember the time when you used to watch something on television and it was not going to be repeated? We all remembered episodes. So to a certain degree, when we don't have to remember, then we don't remember.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the whole point of writing things down is so that we can forget.
Yeah. And it
Yeah.
do work so well when you get older.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Where did I write it down?
Right. Right. But the other question I had, and I don't know if you've looked at this or not, but this idea of what you mentioned from that Arctic perspective of a year and a day. One of the things I thought of was, and this is something that's found in many of the traditions, in the sacred text of the traditions, is humans were given these very long lifespans.
Yeah.
And people have been constantly trying to figure out, well, what was going on? Why would they consistently mention these? But if your day is a lot longer than a
Mm.
24-hour day,
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that would give, these.
Well, what one wonder around it is people have said that it's months rather than years.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But the other one is that the people who are interested in numbers, they do things like add them up and find out
Mm,
what the number is at the bottom
mm,
and things like that. And so in some way there is a notion that a lot of things that we're familiar with are obscure because we haven't reached the level of understanding that somebody put into it.
mm,
So, even our calendar, our clock is amazing because you've got those 12 digits,
mhm,
it's just such and then it maps onto, of course, our keyboards, and so
mm,
it's sort of like all it, how did all this come together? Well, the Sumerians were blamed for some of it.
mm,
They say that they invented 360 degrees and they used base 60, but that required too many numbers basically that were all different looking. So
mm.
so we've gone for 10, which is nice.
Yeah, yeah.
And decimal is the way we think, but it's not clear. And so when you get involved with this, you have to challenge yourself. Am I seeing something because of the tools I use?
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and we often do that. That's that's always
Yeah.
a really important question to ask, you
Mm.
know. And so the megalithic structures, I know that, for example, Stonehenge, usually it's always suggested that, well, that was there for marking the solstices. And there's something similar here in the States, not so far from where I am, Chaco Canyon, which is down in New Mexico. There are markers there for solstices. But what Stonehenge is doing, it's more than just the solstice,
Mm.
right? It's marking a lot of other things.
Mm. Well, some people have called it a repository
Mm,
of information. And when I was in Karnak, you get this spooky feeling that that the stones weren't just arbitrary.
mm,
That there's probably all sorts of messages inside where the stones were. And then in Gavrinis, they have this marvelous wavy graphics
mm,
that's chipped onto the granite, like waves coming out of lines and things like that. But when you look into it, it makes sense from the point of view of counting. So it was their way of counting. And there's one where I know the monuments, and they were all brought into Gavrinis to line the chamber and then they closed it. It
mm,
was the end of that civilization there when they did. And this one stone, I think it's called L5, it left on the fifth one. I swear it has all the measurements and the pictures of what that monument called Lamanio, the quadrilateral, which is near the alignments in Karnak. And so maybe they had an information board, wouldn't that be weird? Because they found all of these stones had different weathering from different angles. So they'd been somewhere different to each other. And so when they built Gavrinis, the idea would be that all the information boards would be put in there. And meanwhile, there would be people who would know about a place. So you'd expect somebody like a druid or otherwise. So people would learn, and the monument could be like a book. And this particular book is a book of 3 lunar years and 3 solar years, sort of in a right triangle. And when you look at it, the upright of the triangle is 1 to 4. And so you get a 4 square rectangle, gives to very high accuracy the relationship between the lunar year and the solar year. It's like really very accurate. And they would have used that once they discovered that. They would have used it. They didn't need to count it anymore, but the counting was there. And they also had 36 stones showing the months during that period for the 3 times 12. So you start to come across an aspect of the creation of the astronomical world that appears to be for us to read. In other words, it's much more simple than it should be. And the numbers seem to be all part of a common body of relationships. And so that there is that's another aspect of this work. And of course, that is spooky in a way, because then this means it was created not by accidental forces. And this is very important for us today, because the accidental force thing has become so strong in us that we think we're completely arbitrary beings, and it doesn't make any difference what we do.
Right.
Yeah. So in a way, if we change the climate or if we destroy anything, it doesn't really matter. And it doesn't really matter what we do to the moon or anything else, because we have this illusion in ourselves that our life is just our life and it's arbitrary, and we're a little speck inside an enormous universe.
Right. Yes. And my day job, if I want to call it that, is, I'm a college professor, and one of the classes I teach is critical thinking, and students are required to write. The whole point of the class is to, think critically, but also to get everything into writing. And so the way I do this is they have a number of issues because they have to write an argumentative essay. And when I'm in the classroom, I let students do this, come up with them on their own. But online, I just okay, here are the things that we're going to do. So you can choose which one you want. And one of the issues that I have students researching right now is mass extinction. And I had 2 students write these papers, and the very preliminary arguments of, well, maybe it's a good thing, because there's no meaning to anything anyway. So yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm just, kind of riffing on what you just said in terms of that lack of meaning or importance.
Yes, that's very, younger people do have a less of a sense of responsibility often for, things like what's happening in the world. So
yeah,
that's reasonable, but it's dangerous, because actually we all do think ourselves as in a default situation. How are we going to build meaning? So with this idea of that it's all like a great big pattern in the sky, and it's only seen from Earth,
right?
And it relies on having the moon, and the moon is a freak accident of some sort, and it itself, just plain simply, has created a lot of opportunities for life, like stabilizing the tilt of the Earth and providing the regions, between sea and land, and so there's a lot to this whole business. So we ditched the ancient model that the Earth was the center of the world, so to speak, the universe.
Yeah, right.
But that's perhaps because we critiqued it on the basis of it being unrealistic and vain.
Yeah.
But in fact, it turns out that all of the Chaldean model that people used to write about, in poems and literature all over the place, and people had religions of different sorts, like Mithraism, and they were all the different planets, and you went through them, and that you evolved or something, and it was a path, a spiritual path. All of that was washed away because it became over realized that the heliocentric, and then Newton, of course, despite being an alchemist, he wanted to banish the idea of spirits moving things, and that tradition has served us well in terms of scientific discovery, because it stopped us mystifying what forces were. But it's we are victims of our path, the historic path of these things. I mean, because we hated religion. If you're a scientist, you hated it because they used to put you in prison and everything else, and throw all your books away. And they told us, and they're still doing this, of course, in the Middle East, that the doctrinal forces have, around about 1000 AD, they got rid of all of their brilliant scientists, and they decided that they were all through with all of that. And they probably would have been a fantastic civilization and would have gone probably to America and everything else if that had not happened. And so it was handed over to us in one way or another. We got all the Greek texts that they had got, but we had not got them during the Dark Age. So all of this got transferred to the European culture of the West, and then out of that came all of this rationalism, various layers of historical movements of thought, rearrangements of religions, led us to where we are, which is, and we have to take responsibility and understand that. So so I'm always learning on this point of view.
Yeah. Well, one of the things because I had one of the students, my comment was that this idea of, well, let's just let humans go, it's whatever. I said, I think that's kind of nihilistic in a way. And they responded. So we ended up having a kind of conversation going online. And the way I described it to her was, I said, look, you're coming from a point of view, and I think this is consistent with what you were just saying, is that, you're a product of modern Western society, and you are viewing the world from a very specific point of view. It's like when you were born, someone put colored glasses on you. And, so you see everything through this specific tint, and you say, oh, well, the world is tinted that way. And I'm like, no, it's the glasses you're looking through are where the tinting is. It's not representation of the world. So let's maybe take those glasses off. Let's ask the question of what would happen if we take those glasses off. Where will we be?
But that's not likely to happen, is it?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's not easy.
Because there's so many forces keeping us the way we are. And so what we need is an intermediate disaster, but definitely not an extinction.
Yeah, let's hope not. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting because, and you're right that, one of the things that got, rejected was that I'm going to try to avoid theological language here, but there is a creative intelligence at play in the universe.
Yeah. Well, it's not unreasonable. Why? But the thing is that as long as we don't look at what the data says about the resonances with the moon and the resonances with Venus, and that these things could be significant, we are not. We're not going to. There's no need for an intelligence.
Right.
I think that the work I've done just shows that there has to be a higher intelligence, and it could be, it could be much closer to us individually than we think. I mean, for instance, there's lots of things going on in a human being that are fascinating. I mean, we have this symmetry between our left and right hand sides, and they have all this creativity in the brain function, but also this competition with the feelings and a moving body. So there are so many things that we could learn to work with that would bring us into our bodies more. I mean, a lot of people are abstracted; they just float around, really.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so easy for them to say it doesn't really matter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's very important that we start recognizing or go back to recognizing that we are bodies. We are embodied beings.
Yeah.
And instead of focusing on escape and that the spirit's all out there, that the spirit's here, it's in the body, it's with the body. I have another question, and I wanted to see if you could maybe explain this to me a little bit. And it kind of goes back to the Vedas and the Arctic sort of origins. And it was this myth of Indra and Indra conquering a dragon. And this is the raising the sun up above the polar horizon, I think is what I've got here on the note. But I was wondering if you could explain this a little bit more to me, because a couple of things that jumped out at me was I don't know much about Vedic astrology, but I know that the nodes of the moon for the eclipses is referred to as the dragon, the head and the tail of the dragon. And there's this theme in other traditions of a god conquering a serpent of sorts.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So that the serpent and dragon story is so clear in the Arctic because the celestial equator is on the horizon all the way around. So the celestial equator, and that's where the sun and moon comes up. And so if there's a node, you're going to see the node. The eclipse is going to be right down there when the sun's down there, or you'll be able to see what's happening quite clearly. And because the sun and the moon both have to be, and they cross at this one point. So there's two crossings going on for the moon and two crossings going on between the sun and the equatorial plane. So one gives us the summer and the winter, and the other gives us this 18.6 year cycle. It's coming to an end or to a climax at the moment in January. So there are two groups of people. Some of them are in favor of the dark, and some are in favor of the light. Now, you see, there's no inherent superiority in the light, because light is to do with existence. But whatever's underneath, it doesn't have to exist, even though it's probably real. You see, so they have their world is broken up clearly for them more, and so they call this sat or existence, and they're down there they call it asat. So that's that which is not existent at the moment, and a powerful way of thinking about the world. And it led them to also, they saw stars literally disappear when they were living up there. They would never rise again. For half the cycle of the processional period, so that's tens of 10,000 years plus. So, and when you hear them talk about the loss of a star or the gaining of a star, they make it sound such a big deal, and that's probably because they were actually witnessing these kinds of things. And so, they would never, well, I mean, they wouldn't be up there, would they, in a few thousand years anyway?
Right.
So, it's Indra is thought to be the pole.
Okay.
And so what Indra does to defeat the darkness and the serpent is to push the pole with the agreement of Vishnu, who is the ecliptic pole, they have to take a big leap, having drunk lots of soma, and then all of the things that live on the ecliptic, half of the ecliptic is revealed. So it's only after Indra's done this that they get to see. So they're really telling a story that makes sense of the situation they see now as not having been like that in the past. That in the past, the planets and the sun, and they would all be going along the ground, effectively, and they would not manifest properly. All you would see was maybe Mercury and Venus occasionally coming up. So the framework of the sky was invented by Indra, and this is the basis of the great story. But again, I couldn't dwell endlessly on it because I have to make a relatively short book.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was curious, and because one of the things that again came to mind when I was reading and you went into this story, like I had mentioned, was that I know that there are other myths of gods vanquishing a serpent. So like in the Samaria, you have Marduk and Tiamat.
Yes, that's right.
But you also have Apollo doing this. And that serpent that location becomes the site for the oracle at Delphi. And one of the things you noted was that the megalithism, if I can say that right, megalithism had in part become the mysteries.
Yeah. Also, if it's associated with women.
Yeah.
And then we have pythonesses who read the fortune from the breathing in the ethane from the geology. But there's also an amazing musical story to do with this as well. I mean, funnily enough, in the world of music, you've got to cut the serpent up into 3 parts in order to get a better tuning system. So that, and so all these, I don't know, hell, I probably become a specialist, haven't I?
Yeah. Well, and my brain is going somewhere else right now.
Right. Very good.
And I don't know if this is anything that you can comment on, but I'll go ahead and mention it. Because this idea of going back to the Indra and being able to see things appearing, right? And I had mentioned Marduk and Tiamat.
Yes.
And then where my brain went was I also know that story is found in the Bible in Genesis 1, where it begins with, the God hovering over over the deep. And the Hebrew word for deep is tehom, which is etymologically related to Tiamat. And so then there is the command, let there be light. And so I was just making that connection with, it's a very different way of thinking in terms of the deep, as maybe the deep is that darkness, and then let there be light is that emergence that you were talking about.
That's right. So Indra was a bringer of light, and so it has always been. You get a very strange thing with the Elohim, because they are ambiguous. And you've got male and female as well coming into that. But then you get suddenly transported into Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And Eve is very similar to a matrilineal, and she takes the apple from the tree at the center of the garden, which is obviously really the astronomy on the polar axis, and the tree of life, as it's called. It was, sometimes people call that. And so gave it to Adam, and then he gets a big telling off because they were told not to eat it. And so is this a symbol of transmission to the patriarchal world of the astronomical knowledge, which has led us to indeed plow a lot of furrows, because that was the curse that was put on Adam, that because he wasn't happy with just the knowledge of God, I suppose.
Yeah.
Do you think that was it theologically?
It's possible. I know that one of the readings and interpretations of the story is the connection of the serpent in Eden with the goddess traditions, because goddess is always associated with serpents.
Yeah.
Now, the reading has always been because Eve, which means mother of all life,
Yes.
right? That the female is the generator of life. And serpents, they shed their skins and everything. But that's just one way of reading it, the connection between the female and the serpent. But the other one is, what you're talking about, which is that cosmic serpent of sorts. And yeah, it's possible, I suppose, because, when you're in with the story of Eden, they're not farming. They don't have to farm. Everything's there,
Yes.
which represents
That's right.
the cultures of, the hunter-gatherers. And then it's a transmission of knowledge, because that's actually where the fruit came from, was the
Yeah.
tree of knowledge.
And the serpent said, no,
Yeah.
it is good to eat.
Yeah. 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 And then we got banished, right? And when we got banished, we were banished kind of into ignorance and banished into toil,
Toil.
working the soil.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah. 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 Very interesting. Very interesting. And I'm curious, it also seems that with this, that there is, we don't know. We've forgotten a lot of things, and I don't know if you've probably have seen the news. And this was just like a month or two ago, that a tablet was found excavated in Babylon, I believe, that had the Pythagorean theorem on it, and it predated Pythagoras by
Of
like a good
course.
1,000
Yes.
years.
Right.
You know,
Well, of course, there's a similar thing that done in rock in Spain, and it showed an elegant proof just using multiple squares. And the 345 that they used at Karnak, of course, they understood all about Pythagorean triangles.
right.
And so, but Pythagoras, he was a man who just said he brought everything together from the mysteries.
Right. Yeah. So it all predates him. Yeah.
Yeah.
It all predates him. Yeah. 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 That makes sense. I had an instructor once. I took a whole course on the mystery traditions, and he wanted to present a mystery to us at the very end. And it was one of the platonic solids he
Yeah.
had in a form, which is a geometric form.
Yeah.
So,
That's right. Well, they were all over Britain in
yeah,
the Stone Age.
right.
They keep on finding them in groups, in bags and things like that. But they
Oh,
get relegated to museums, and no one is allowed to discuss the fact that these guys understand platonic solids.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that we've forgotten. It's quite fascinating. So, but what you've demonstrated in your book is that this knowledge did pass on to some extent, and you place
Lot.
it in some of the Christian churches and Angkor Wat, that temple. And so it's there, at least the people who had built these structures had some knowledge of it, but then we just see it, oh, that's a beautiful building.
Well, like I say, probably your average man wouldn't be able to even be told what was going on.
Right.
So, the interesting thing with Angkor Wat, of course, is that it comes from a Shakti culture.
Yeah, goddess culture.
Like Southeast Asia was like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was all very fascinating. And what you wrote, and I loved this, Lance. I'm not going to read the whole sentence here, but you noted the megalithic vision that saw the whole sky as a form rather than a set of facts. Yeah,
I'm only on the edge of that myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can go a lot deeper, I think. And so I know that we're starting to run out of time here, but where are you going next with all of this?
Well, I got quite interested in David Bohm, actually,
Okay.
and quantum mechanics. So I've had to learn about what's been happening in the area of, nuclear physics and stuff. I mean, by that, I mean, just from a layman's point of view, because I've been going to a dialogue group, for instance, and dialogue, through his insights, he realized that when people get together like we do with Zoom, that if you have a conversation without there being an agenda, interesting things can happen, and more people perhaps could do that, and they wouldn't really know what they would together formulate.
Right.
And I used to be interested in J.G. Bennett, who was a Gurdjieffian, and he saw the next epoch as being synergic. That before this, it would be the ego, the big ego, the megalanthrope. It's all about who invented what. Whereas we're only just starting to learn how groups can work in creative ways, I think. So I'm quite interested in understanding that. And I've also been interested in Sufi mysticism, because some of them practiced things which appear to be in different dimensions. So there might be a connection there somehow between, because I analysed the Kaaba in my previous book. I found it full of fascinating resonances, and to do the megalithic and to do with geometry, because of course it's in the modern epoch. But of course they never allow anybody to comment on it, and they never allow anybody to do any archaeology there. So, and there are other things like that. So I might try to paint a picture that takes the current era. But maybe I should stop writing. I don't know. But writing is also a tool. It makes you do the work to research things. So maybe if I didn't have that, I would, and I wouldn't achieve anything.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe you can advise. Maybe I need a psychologist.
No, don't look at me for advice. But no, writing, the way I said that I teach, and I have to teach argumentative essays. What I always tell students is writing is thinking, because it's not just doing the research, but you have to like sit down and say, okay, now how do I want to say this? How do I present this? So it's thinking, clear writing is clear thinking.
And the Greeks were the first people to have a reasonable population of readers and writers.
Right.
And when they chucked out the mythology, more or less, they ended up sending each other pen pal letters, didn't they, across the Mediterranean? And it must have been slow work for them to arrive. But out of that, we see the beginnings of free thinking, where you can see what you think, and you can write things that you could never think.
Right.
You just sort of like, you write them. So language itself is a fantastically powerful tool.
Yeah. And there's still something quite mysterious about language as well, as in terms of when did it first appear and how, and we just don't know. We just don't know. So
it appears our brains have parts in them that know about language already. So and that's another one of these coincidence things, that maybe language comes from a much more distant period.
I think it was that what Noam Chomsky, his contribution was that the brain was set up for, it had structures for language. We were born with it. And you would have to ask the question, well, if we were born with these structures, why was it that language only appeared 40,000 years ago? Human evolution has been going on for quite a longer period of time. So I know we've covered a lot of ground, and let me ask you this before I let you go. Actually, I've got another question on top of this, but is there anything out of the book that we glossed over or didn't address that you think is really important for people to know about, or to pique their interest in the book?
Well, the greatest realization, really, after a while, it happened for me. I saw that the orbits of the moon pick up all of the different positions of the planets.
Mm.
And that if you draw this into a picture, which appears on page 223 of the book at the end, under a section called The Grand Design, the Chaldean model is transformed into being a perfect mandala.
Right.
And so I believe that the mandala system, is inherent with human beings, just like language.
Mm.
And it's because we belong to this system that surrounds us, and maybe it's been informing us in various ways, environmental ways or other things. And so we have certain patterns that we respond to that are helpful for us. And it went all the way to Mars. So all of the planets were accounted for, and you'll see that anyway if you get a copy. But we've talked about so many good things in this conversation that I'm not the least bit unhappy.
Well, that's good. That's good. I'm happy to hear that. But yeah, thank you for bringing up the mandala. I know that Carl Jung suggested that mandalas are symbols of wholeness, of completeness. But I also know, and I'm curious now, whether or not you've investigated anything to this end. Like, for example, I've been to Nepal a few times, and one of the largest Buddhist stupas in South Asia is there, Bodhnath. And Bodhnath is a mandala, and so.
Right. Well, there's this particular geometry, which is the Earth and the Moon, and it's shown in various ways. But in the previous book, it was everywhere, and in this book it's almost everywhere.
Right.
And over thousands of years these monuments exist, and the Buddhist ones, Sachi is the one that I analyzed previously, and you find that the distances around the outside are a certain number of inches, so they're an astronomical period. And so who's doing this? When these Buddhist monks are sent out to take the Buddha's bones and put them in all these stupas, they must have had knowledge. Maybe we can get knowledge if we become realized that doesn't have to be passed through transmission, which is a Chan idea, isn't it? Outside the tradition.
Yeah. Well, and also I always like in the Chan or Zen, there's this idea that the knowledge can't be spoken in a way. There's this story of the Buddha. Apparently, it's when Siddhartha remembered his past lives on the night of his awakening, and he remembered seeing the previous Buddha and was at the teachings, and that's what woke up the bodhicitta in that previous version of Siddhartha. But all that that previous Buddha gave all the teachings just by raising a finger. Just like that, and not saying a word. The
silent teaching.
Yeah. And that's kind of what this is, isn't it? So the silent teaching. Yeah.
Well, the mandala is really.
Yeah. And that's a whole other area of investigation, it seems. I think that, like in the tantric text, you have the Sri Yantra, which is all geometric design. Yeah. So, all right. Do you have a web page that people can go to?
Yeah. It's called Sacred, full stop, number sciences, full stop, org. Well, we call it dot, don't we, these days?
Yeah.
So it's sacred dot number sciences dot org. So if you go to that website, I've got an online magazine as well of my research work, but there's all the stuff about the books there as well.
All right.
And would like people to enjoy some of these things.
All right. Okay. And that the magazines can be found at the website then?
This magazine is basically what I've retitled it, because it's just an enormous 250,000 words of lots of work that I've done. But each one has been crafted and taken time to do. Some not, but most of them have. And so it's a useful resource, but it doesn't tell the big stories like the books do.
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed the book. It was very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
As has been this conversation.
Right.
Like I said, I will tell you what I came away with was that I felt like I needed to read some of the other books to help get a better understanding. But
Yes.
going through just kind of checking my notes before our conversation really helped a lot. So I think I was able to
Yeah.
get stuff. But yeah, it's very intriguing and brings to light a lot of questions, I think.
Yeah. If you have any suggestions, please let me know, will you?
Sure, of course.
Of what would be helpful to put up, or how things could be reorganized.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was well done, but I'm not a numbers person. So a lot of that just
Oh,
kind of, my eyes get a little bit glazed over. But it was the reviewing again. I'm like, oh, okay. And it was things I had highlighted too. I forgot, but that's the whole point of highlighting. You
it
highlight so
is.
you don't have to
You can
remember.
read it more quickly. Yeah. Right on.
All right. Well, Richard, thank you so
Good.
much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And then I very much appreciated the conversation.
Thank you, Nick. It was great all round. Thank you.
And that's a wrap on episode 142 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're part of my YouTube audience. Now you know what's coming up next. All the usual. Sign up for my Patreon, and don't forget, I've got several perks for Patreon members, including ad-free content. I know how annoying those ads can be. Also, please share this with friends, family, coworkers even, and on social media. Subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. You know the grind. But here's the thing, all that really is important. Putting together this podcast is a labor of love. I'm in the process of making changes to improve the podcast and the YouTube channel, but it's slow going. Your support will help me speed up the process and ensure that I can continue with the podcast and offer much more content than what I do now. As I always like to say, I'm here in the Front Range now doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality, and ecology, consciousness and psychedelics, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the rebel spirit, and I sure hope that you do, then please, by all means, help me in my efforts in sharing the good news. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.